So we left off talking about information processing theory. This is a newer theory that equates the process of the human brain and the way that we absorb information and process it to the way that a computer does that. It's a perspective that compares human thinking processes to computer analysis of data, including sensory input, connections, stored memories, and output. And so this theory really says that we as human beings are effectively complex computers. So the perception is the mental processing of information that arrives at the brain from the sensory organs. Affordance is the opportunity for perception and interaction offered by a person, place, or object in the environment. And if you see down here the cat and the rock and the human and the mouse, they all three have a different affordance for that rock. The cat sees the rock as something that hides the prey. The mouse sees the rock as something to hide or climb. The human sees the rock as something they can throw, use as a tool, or that they could hurt their toe if they kick the rock. And then you'll see the way that we figure out the affordance of how to use different ways of turning on light, for example, push a button, switch a flip, or knob that we rotate. All of those are us using our perception to figure out how to manipulate something in our world to use in a certain way. That's an affordance. Selective perception is a person's age will change what affordance he or she sees, what they see as a possibility. The more experience we have with an object, the wider variety of affordances we may be able to use that object for. So research on early affordances says that as information processing improves over the first year, infants become quicker to recognize ways they can use objects in different methods or different ways. So they may use an object one way, consistently shake the rattle. And then they start to figure out they can use the rattle not just to shake it, but to throw it, or to chew on it, or to hit it against a drum, or you get the idea. Lots of different affordances build up by those experiences of the infant trying different things. Visual cliff is an experimental apparatus that was used to figure out what children's depth perception was and whether or not they perceived a virtual cliff and would stop when they crawled at the edge of it. It gives an illusion of a sudden drop-off between one horizontal surface and another. So if you see this baby, over here it looks as if that clear plexiglass drops. Depth perception was once thought a visual deficit that prevented babies from seeing the drop. Now there's actually not just whether or not they see the drop, or whether or not they perceive the drop as being dangerous. So younger babies would crawl out over that plexiglass without noticing it, theoretically. And then as they got older, they would start to notice that cliff and do what this baby's doing, where they would look over the edge and perceive it as a drop. Babies pay more attention to things that move and to people particularly. This is definitely one of the ways that babies adapt to the world very quickly. Our genetics, our nature is pre-programmed to notice other human beings. It's how we adapt culturally to the world that we're born into. Dynamic perception is the perception that is primed to focus on movement and change, and that exists in every baby at birth. There's a people preference that also exists. It's a universal principle of infant perception, consisting of an innate attraction to other humans. Babies innately, just naturally prefer looking at a human face, and that's across the globe. Memory processing and remembering events requires a certain amount of experience and brain maturation. It doesn't happen automatically. Memories are particularly evident when experimental conditions are similar to real life, when the motivation's high to remember, for example, a favorite toy behind a screen. Retrieval is strengthened by reminders and repetition. So the more a child does something, the easier they will remember that thing or that action. Roe v. Collier experimented this with a demonstration with 3-month-old infants. They found that infants could remember after 2 weeks if they had a brief reminder session before being retested. So this experiment, they tied a string loosely around a young baby's ankle, and then that string was connected to a toy on the other side, a rattle that would shake. And they showed the infant that it would shake, and the infants figured out if they kicked, the rattle shaked. And then after 2 weeks, they looked to see whether the baby remembered that the rattle would shake if the string was tied. And with a little remembering, with somebody shaking their leg and the rattle rattling, the baby would remember and start kicking their leg on their own. So language, let's talk about language. This is an interesting part of cognition. Language is really a cognitive process. Language is the primary means of communication between human beings, and definitely among children with their adults. They need language to survive and to get the basic necessities of the world. When they're newborn, babies really only have reflexive communication. They cry, they have movements, facial expressions. Pretty quickly, caregivers start to notice which cries have different meanings for a particular baby. They'll recognize a hungry cry versus an uncomfortable, wet cry versus a tired cry. So the cries have variety, but it's one of the primary functions for a baby to communicate with the caregivers. By 2 months old, the babies are able to make a whole bunch of meaningful noises, cooing, fussing, laughing, different varieties of cries. By 3 to 6 months, babies develop new sounds, including squeals, growls, croons, trills, and vowel sounds. Ah, 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 ah. And so you'll hear children start to make those babbly vowel sounds and make those funny little sounds that people put up on YouTube. 6 to 10 months old, babbling begins. It usually includes both a consonant and a vowel sounds and repeated in syllables. One of the easiest vowel consonant combinations to make for a baby is da 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 da. It's just the tongue bouncing on the roof of the mouth. So if you try and say da 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 da, ma 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 ma, the physical function of the mouth does the da sound easier than it does the ma sound. In a lot of cultures where da da means daddy and mama means mommy, the human beings in the baby's life will recognize da 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 and encourage it as, oh, they're saying daddy, and the baby gets a lot of attention for using that sound. And so they repeat it more often. By 10 to 12 months, there's comprehension of simple words, speech-like intonations, specific vocalizations that have meaning to those who know the infant well. Often, the primary caregiver will say, I know what that means, the baby's saying this, but other people can't interpret that same sound as easily. Children who are deaf or babies who are deaf express their first signs or sign language. Hearing babies also use specific gestures, pointing to communicate. There are some teachers and families that use sign language with babies because they can communicate with their fingers faster than they can use the muscles of their mouths to repeat words. And so the ability to use sign language develops faster than the ability to use verbal speech. At 12 months old is when the baby speaks their first real distinguishable spoken word typically. For some babies that's sooner, and for some it's later. They're recognizably part of the native language, and other people would recognize that sound as well, not just the primary caregiver. By 13 to 18 months old, there's a slow growth in vocabulary. Usually the baby has about 50 words within the primary language. By 18 months, there's a naming explosion, and especially in Western cultures, when babies are pointing to objects, we're naming them constantly. And so as we name the objects, babies start to recognize those words: cat, dog, chair, table, food. And so there's a naming of objects that explodes at about that age. Some toddlers don't speak yet at 18 months, so there is an incredible variation between different children. At 21 months is usually when you see the first 2-word sentence, and then multi-word sentences usually appear at about 24 months old, moving from 2-word to 3-word. and then more complicated. Two-word sentences typically are a noun and a verb. Dog bark, baby eat, and so simple combinations of things they're familiar with. There's a universal sequence and timing to language. Most advanced 10% of 2-year-olds speak more than 550 words, so there is variety in how the timing and the acquisition happens, but the sequence is universal. The least advanced 10% speak fewer than 100 words. And so within that variety, often the difference is how much are they hearing language. Babies that hear more language will use more language. Although timing varies, sequence is the same worldwide. We see the same sequence of development from babbling to sounds that the caregiver recognizes to sounds that others recognize and so forth, just like in the previous chart. The ages just fluctuate depending on exposure and home language. Listening and responding. Infants begin learning language before birth. The hearing develops, remember, in the last trimester. Newborns look closely at facial expressions, and they really prefer to hear speech over any other sounds. Here you see this baby paying very close attention to the adult's face and watching as the adult is making sounds. Adults talk to babies usually with a higher pitch, simpler words. They repeat words over and over. Sometimes there's an exaggerated tone, or they vary their speed. They speak slower to babies. It's called baby talk or motherese. The scientific term is child-directed speech. So when we're talking to a baby, we may say, "Oh, you got your toes. And so that is an example of child-directed speech. So even parents that don't use that high-pitched or the baby oh-ba-doo-doo-doo cooing sorts of sounds may use slower speech, which is something that's commonly used. If you know somebody is learning a second language, you may slow down speech to make sure there's comprehension, or ask somebody to slow down speech so that you can comprehend what they're saying. And so it makes sense that we're doing that with babies as they're learning language as well. At 6 to 9 months old, babies begin to repeat certain syllables. Babbling, ba 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 da 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 are two of the first ones that come out of a baby's mouth. And da 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 gets recognized very quickly in most cultures where the father figure is active in the baby's life, and the name for them is considered da or daddy or dada. And so that gets encouraged and therefore becomes a word more often rapidly for the baby than other sounds they may be babbling. Hollow phrase is a single word that expresses a complete, meaningful thought. A hollow phrase may be mama or papa or dada. Hollow phrase could be cat, could be bottle, could be any one of those, milk. Depends on the language the child is hearing and what they're referencing. But that hollow phrase often has deeper meaning. I'm hungry, could you please give me a bottle? But they would use one word for that. The naming explosion, sudden increase in infants' vocabulary. They're listening to everything around them, and so there's a huge explosion of those words. There's cultural differences. Cultures and families vary a great deal in how much child-directed speech children hear. The idea that children should be seen and not heard is contrary to the emphasis on communication in most U.S. families, but it depends on what culture a child's being raised in, what words they're exposed to, and what their first words will be. So I want you to think in discussion this week about what your first words were. What do you know about your first words? Or if you can't remember your own or aren't able to talk to your parents about this, and you have a child or know somebody with a child, what were their first words? Were these started as a babble, like the da-da-da example that we talked about earlier? Became daddy as parents recognized the sound and reinforced it? Or was it something else? If you spoke 2 languages at home, which language was your first word spoken in? How did you as parents, or how did your parents respond when they heard those first words come out, if you remember, or if you're able to ask? And how were these first words reinforced by your family culture? So for an example, a child in our family might go da da da, we went dog. We might have excitedly said dog because there were dogs in their environment. We might have interpreted that as meaning dog. That would be something related to our family culture. Children can master 2 languages, but the crucial variable is how much speech in both language the child hears. Do they hear both languages consistently? Is the grammar correctly used in both languages? Sometimes hearing 2 languages slows down grammar. It takes longer to understand how words should be combined. But it does happen. They do learn grammar in both of those languages. It just can be a little delayed sometimes. There's theories of language learning, and we'll get into this in the next video, looking at the schools of thought of how children learn language. So take some time, think about your second response to the discussion, and then come back and watch the rest of the video.